And let me share my screen. Okay. All right, and let me bring up Canvas. All right, can you all see my screen over here? Bring up the chat. All right, awesome. All right, if you have any questions, just put them on the chat, okay? All right, so let's first take a look at where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going. So I'm sorry I couldn't make it last lecture. I wasn't feeling very well, and I did record a lecture prior to this. I hope you've had a chance to take a look at it. If you haven't, we'll go over it together and just catch up and bring everybody up to speed, and we're going to build on that and go further than and implement a couple more features there as well. Also, I know there's some folks were having trouble connecting to the database to implement their DB7 and DB8 assignment. Let's see, there's a question on the chat. Can you explain how useParam from React works again? Does it look for whatever is after the colon symbol in the URL? Yes, it does, but we will go over that in more detail today. We'll have a couple more examples on how that works, and we'll get a chance to practice that. But yes, and if you want to ask again when we are at that particular point, then feel free to point it out. So yeah, so I know that some folks have had some challenges with DB7 and DB8, and I just want to make sure that everybody's calm and not going crazy. These two particular assignments are mostly for bringing you up to speed with technology that I hope will be useful for you to be productive in implementing a final project. Okay, the assignment DB7, the intention there is to give you a means of creating connections to a database from an application so that you can then build something around that. Okay. I mean, it's not useful if it's just there in the database and you can only access it through a console, right? Ideally, for any application that you want to build, you need some means of data and inserting it and updating it and manipulating, interacting with it. So we talked about that for DB7 and the RMs and JDBC and all that, right? That was the intention of that, being able to talk to the database using Java. Now, for the project, if you feel more comfortable using something else other than Java, because maybe you've learned how to do it using Python or some other language that you feel more comfortable, go ahead. You feel free to use that instead. That's in the project, right? But for the lecture and for the syllabus in this course, right, we've chosen Java, right, and which I believe most of everybody in this class should be familiar with Java programming language, since I know there are many other courses that you might have or should have seen before this that describe the Java programming language. Now, for the front end, which is the focus of the current assignment, DB8, that focuses on a user interface, right? We do need, if this is going to be a user interacting with a database, then we need to be able to render data on a screen. And there are many options on how we would possibly do that. We could have just stuck with Java. Java has plenty of user interface widgets and whatnot that we could have used there. But instead, I chose React.js. It's a very, very popular library that it's taking the world by storm. And it's definitely a great skill to have under your belt. And so this is just a very, very brief introduction to React.js. We don't really go into much detail. If you do want to more, certainly there's an entire course on React.js, which I encourage you to pursue. But we're only giving you the absolute minimum to make you productive and let you build some really, really simple user interface. And we're not asking for anything more than what we're giving you as a starting code. So don't go crazy, thinking that you need to build some really sophisticated, fancy user interface. What we're giving you here in the assignment, that's plenty. That's more than you really need. But if you do want to explore, then feel free and go ahead. But definitely don't feel obligated. Let's see. There's a question on the chat. How can we partner with people who have another database and design? Another database and design professor. Not sure what you mean. Do you mean that in the same team, that two teams might have two different databases? I'm not quite sure about that question. Perhaps we could do that. Take that offline, and you can ping me later, and then we can chat about that specific question. So yeah. So these two assignments are meant to get you going and giving you some tools to go ahead and start building a project. So because there is a final project due at the end of the semester, I encourage you to get started right now. You'll need to create a couple of UML diagrams. You'll need to include some very common associations or relationships, right? One-to-many, many-to-many. You'll have to have at least one user. You'll need to have at least a couple of classes that represent some objects or that are related to each other somehow, right? And it's really up to you what it is that you want to build. I'll give you some examples of what might be useful things that you might want to work on, but really it's up to you and your partners in your team. So let's go. So let's review the syllabus and see where we are and where we are going. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Right. So these. This is not it. This is absolutely not it. That's the wrong course. Oops, let me see. No, why are you navigating there? This one. Okay, let's look at the syllabus. Okay, so in the syllabus, let's take a look at I've made a couple of minor changes. Right, so these are the two assignments that I'm talking about, right? So notice that I've changed the due dates of DB7 and to coincide with the due date of DB8, right? They somewhat build on each other. The first one just walks you through getting familiar with JDBC and getting familiar with ORM on how is it that you interact programmatically with the database. That's DB7. In DB8 basically gives you the solution to DB7. Nevertheless, right, we want you to practice and become familiar with DB7. DB8 starts where DB8 finishes, right? It just continues and says, okay, well, now that you have a data model, and now that you're exposing that data to the database through an HTTP API, let's build a user interface to it, right? So that some human being can actually interact with this data. And so both of them are related. And so they're both due a week from today, Friday, March 26th. And I know some of you have been having challenges connected to the database, so I've been putting some extra office hours. We did one this morning. Some students came, and I was able to help them connect to the database. Some of them were as simple as they hadn't put the username and password to the database. Some of them were that they had a test function in the wrong place, and we just moved it around, and it worked fine. Some of them are a little more challenging. But definitely come by these extra office hours so that we can help you connect your projects to the database and get you going. The TAs as well, they're going to be offering also a couple of additional extra office hours for helping you out. And we want you to be successful. We want you to be productive. We want you really to get the most out of this course and be successful in your careers. So let's see. So yeah, due next Friday. Then after that, we are going to come back on the next week number 10. We're going to be talking about transactions. And now that we're building applications, usually database applications are not meant to be used by just one single user. Typically, there's going to be dozens, hundreds, thousands of users using the same database. So we have to be able to configure our database to be able to support all these multiple users, hitting the database at the same time simultaneously, right? So transactions are going to allow us to do just that, right? How is it that we configure so that folks are not trampling on each other, right? Also, we'll talk about how to optimize using indexes, right? We'll also talk about on week number 11, we'll talk about other types of databases, right, that are not relational databases, such as non-relational databases such as Firebase and Mongo, and we'll get you going on that. If you prefer to use those other databases, feel free, right? You're not for the project, right? For the project, you're free to explore, right? If you rather not use Java and you rather use some other programming language, go right ahead. If you don't want to use MySQL or relational database, and you prefer to use a non-relational database like Mongoose or Firebase, go right ahead. Okay. Then the last 2 weeks are going to be a little bit open-ended. Certainly there's a couple more topics that we can chat about on week 12. I did want to leave it open so that if you need help getting going with the project, we can certainly use those 2 weeks to do that. There's plenty of other things that you might need for your project. Maybe you want to be able to log in or might maintain some session information, maybe some more user interface, or there's plenty of other topics in databases. Certainly there's XML, interacting with XML data sources, databases. There's definitely that topic. We can certainly fill in some of those topics in these 2 weeks. But I do want to make sure that we have some time to get you going and helping you going with the project. So the week number 14, right? We're gonna have a review of the final exam, just like we did for the previous exam. I'll give you some sample questions that you might expect, and we'll work through those questions together, preparing you for the final exam. In the final exam, you will do the same thing as the previous exam. Right? We'll open it up and leave it open for several days, and so that you can take the exam whenever it's more convenient for you. Right. So that's the final exam. The project is due on the 26th, the 15th week, and what we'll ask is to meet with the TAs, right? And you'll demo your project to the TA, right? And they'll just ask you questions, and they'll fill in some check boxes, and making sure that you met certain requirements. We will go over specific requirements, and this our next lecture we'll talk about specific requirements of the what are the minimum things that we expect you to do in the project. So we'll do that next lecture on Tuesday. So yeah, so the TAs will use that, and this just checking off, making sure that you did meet all those minimum requirements. Okay. So anyway, so that's the plan for the rest of the semester. Any questions? Oh, one thing, the quiz for this week, I postponed it and moved it to next week, right? Because you're still working through those that assignment. So I moved it to give you just one more week to finish that up, and then we'll do the ORM quiz next Friday. Let's see, there's a question on the chat. So assignment due dates are going to be on Fridays, right? Yes, I did move all the assignment due dates. I moved them to Friday instead of Tuesday. And we have some wiggle room here, right? If we need to move them a little further out, maybe to Sunday or things like that, definitely we could discuss that as we see how folks are doing. What other engagement you guys are working, classes and assignments and whatnot. So yeah, so keep me up to date on that as well. Okay. All right, let's get going then. So let's review where we left off in the lecture that I posted earlier. I think it was yesterday, the day before. I posted a video lecture for the lecture that we missed, the previous lecture on Tuesday that we missed. And so I hope, I encourage you to go back, and if you haven't watched that lecture, definitely I encourage you to take a look at that. That goes into nitty-gritty detail on getting started on DB8, our 8th assignment, the web development assignment. We're going to go over today here. We're going to skim through it, right? Just to get us up to speed of where we are, where we left off in that video, and then so we can move on. Okay. All right. So let's review the previous lecture. But definitely, I encourage you to take a look at that lecture that I. So here's the assignment. Yeah. So the assignment asked us to implement the following. Okay. So we have a table called. Can you see my screen? Everything's visible. So in the, we have in the database, we have a table called users that has, several users in there. And so we want to build a user interface that allows us to interact with that particular table. One of the screens that we're going to be building is called user list. And like the name says, right, it's just going to list the users in that table. It also allows us to navigate when we click on a specific user, it allows us to navigate to another screen that displays the information, the detailed information for that particular user that we clicked on here on the left-hand side. So if we click on this user, then you see the details on this right-hand side, right? If you click cancel, it goes back to the previous screen. It also allows us to add a user, so that if we click on the add user, it also navigates to this user editor, but leaves all the fields blank, right? So that you can type the information for that brand new user. And then you can click on create, and then it inserts that record in the database, right? You can also, if you click on an existing user, you can also delete that user by clicking on that delete on the user that you just selected. Or you can also make changes to that user, click on save, right? It'll update the data in the database and then come back to the user list, right? So yeah, so the focus of this assignment is to get going so that you can interact with an individual table, right? And obviously we can talk about things that are a little more sophisticated, like for instance, what about one-to-many relationships, right? Like for instance, if you have a particular user and that user has many blogs, one cool thing that you like to be able to do is navigate to the blogs for that user, right? If I navigate to a different user, I can see the blogs for that other user. Yes, maybe something down here that would list or give you a link that would navigate you to some other record or those records for that particular user. And definitely we could totally do that. So we walk you through this, right? Again, we're asking you to practice and feel, gather some confidence that you can use this, what we're giving you, to then go on and explore your own and build something more interesting, right? We do give you the project, and we ask you to review some source code that we already gave you, right? For instance, we do have a data model for a user table, right? That we're already giving you that matches the schema for the database that we're giving you. We also give you a repository that allows you to implement all the CRUD operations for interacting with that particular table. So we give you that. We also give you the beginnings, actually no, an entire DAO, right, an ORM DAO that interacts with the database, right? That allows you to create, read, update, delete users in the database, right? Now the implementation is slightly different than DB7, right? DB7, now let me show you. In DB7, the implementation of the ORM in DB7 was slightly different, right? The signatures of the function were slightly different. For instance, the create user, I believe, in DB7 had several strings, right, that you can access, you can provide data, and which were read off of the URL that we sent over here, right? This was slightly different, right? And in that, notice that it's not accepting strings or any primitive data types here. See that? Instead, is accepting a full-blown class, right? So an instance of a user, that's what it's accepting, right? So that's new. And notice that data is not being passed in the path. See this? So in that sense, it's slightly different implementation from what we did in DB7. This one's a little more interesting. Well, the data is instead not instead of being passed through the path variables, instead is being passed in the HTTP body, right? So what happens is that when you send information, when browsers or any client, really, when any two machines or any two algorithms, when they communicate amongst themselves, right, they can pass data in various ways, right? The more common way is through path variables, right? Well, not more common, one way. The other way is that the HTTP message that goes back and forth the messages have headers at the top and it has bodies at the bottom, right? And in the body, you can put anything you want, right? The headers usually is for metadata, right? You know, where is it coming from? Where's it going? Who sent it? You know, the time of day, like a timestamp, all sorts of, you know, credentials, login credentials, things like that. The body is usually reserved for the transport of the data that is going back between the two machines, right? And it could be anything in there. It could be, you know, PDF files that we are uploading, or you know, submitting a resume, or we're, you know, we took a snapshot with our phone and we're uploading that image to a server. Then the payload, the body, would be this image file that we are uploading, right? So the body can contain anything, right? In our case, we know that the data that these machines, these processes are sharing is encoded in a particular way, right? We've chosen that the format of the data that's going back and forth is JSON, right? And we know that the format of that JSON matches very nicely with the data model of this user here, right? That we have first names and last names and whatnot, right? So basically what we're going to be doing is sending across JSON data that has fields that are called first name and last name and username, right? And we can map that JSON to this Java data model. So notice now that we have like 3 different ways of representing our data, right? One is the record that is stored in the database. Another one is the way we are representing here in memory in Java. And then we have yet another representation that is being sent across from browsers, right? There some folks are filling out a form and that data is coming here. So there's 3 different ways of representing the data. And that conversion has to happen between the multiple layers, right? From the browser, it needs to be converted from JSON to this Java instance. And then it will be stored in the database, it needs to be converted into SQL as insert into a relational schema. And that's very, very common in the industry, right? That you're going to have multiple hops, and you're going to have multiple representation of the same schema, and it's the role of this software engineer to make sure that all these translations happen in correctly. Okay, you know, we are information engineer, right? And it is our role to engineer the means by which information is manipulated, converted, transferred, and used. Okay, so we are the keepers of the information. All right, so yeah, so it's slightly different. Also, notice that the URLs are slightly different from DB7. Also notice that in DB7 we use get everywhere, get mapping everywhere. They're all gets, but here not so. Okay, so basically what's happening here is that we are following certain industry standards, well, not standards, but industry conventions. Okay, conventions like in convention. For instance, you know, somebody decided that classes are capitalized and naming names in Java are camel cased, right? somebody decided that we have semicolons and parentheses and blah, 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 right? Somebody came up with all those standards. Well, there is a industry standard or convention that if we are talking to the database and we are inserting into the database, right, and I'm controlling the database through an HTTP interface, right, and I'm telling the database to insert data, then I should not use get, right? Get should only be used for when you are retrieving data from the database. You're doing a read operation, right? So for instance, find all users, or find a single record, or find me all the records, right? Those are read operations. We are reading, extracting data from the database. So gets are appropriate, right? And so that's one of the conventions. Okay. If we're inserting data into the database, we should instead use HTTP post. Okay, so this, right, is being mapped to an HTTP post as opposed to a get, right? And same thing down here, right? The convention says, right, if we are removing data from the database, then we should be using an HTTP delete, right? Or if we are modifying, right, we're doing an update in the database, we should use instead a put, an HTTP put. It's just a convention, right? It's a very, very strong convention, right? It even has a name. It's called RESTful Web Services. Okay, RESTful stands for representational state transfer, right? You can look it up and you can Google it. It's a pretty cool standard or set of conventions. The other convention, and another part of the convention, is that what these machines or what these processes are exchanging is data, right? So there's data coming and going, right? It is not meant for, even though we are using URLs, right? We typically associate URLs to URLs that you type into a browser, and typically what you see is some website, yes? And those websites are, they're pretty and they have colors and images and videos and whatnot, and those are designed for human consumption. Here, these URLs are not for human consumption, right? They are exposing data that is coming from a database, right? So they're not meant for human consumption. Instead, they're URLs. These URLs are meant for exchanging data between processes, right? Between algorithms, right? So to distinguish the fact from URLs for human consumption and URLs for data consumption, usually the convention says you should prepend your URL with some token that clearly identifies this as a data source, right? Not for human consumption. So a very common token is /API, right? Other conventions might be /REST or data, right? Or JSON or XML or things like that, right? I'm using API. API is very, very common. The other convention is that, if you're talking to a table or a set of records and they are clearly defined, they have a very clear name of what it is that you're storing, well, then you should use that as part of the URL, right? So in our particular case, we are interacting with a users table. So users is a very, very appropriate name to distinguish what it is that we are interacting with. Yeah? You notice that all our URLs have API users. See that? API users, API users, API users, okay? The other convention says that if you don't provide a key or some unique identifier, then it means that you are talking about, or that you're trying to interact with the entire collection of whatever it is that you're storing, right? So in this case, users here and users here, right? For instance, this is the interpretation for this would be that because you're not providing a primary key, any identifier, then that means that you want all the records, right, in that table, right? And indeed, that's what we want, a list of user records, yes? As opposed to this one, right, where we are indeed providing a primary key at the end of the URL, and that should be interpreted as we really don't want all the records, we want just one record, and it's identified this primary key, and the encoding should be done at the end of the URL. Make sense? Right, so these are all conventions, right? And I've tried to follow those conventions. These are all best practices that you should be expected to adhere to. You know, if you go out and work for folks and you're creating these kinds of API, it's a very common thing to do. And it's a great skill to have, right? All these skills are very sought after in industry. All right, excellent. So let's one more thing. The data, as I mentioned, right, it's encoded inside of the body of the HTTP request. And so this request body is able to parse, right, the JSON that it contains the data, right, and map and instantiate an instance of a matching user or data model, and then populate the data from the JSON to the Java world. In this case, we're using it so that we can update a user, right? A user that we want to update, right? We want to retrieve that first user, then update all its fields, and then save it back, right? Just update it into the database, right? So we'll come back and review each one of these, right? Okay, so having said all this, right, and having all this in the data model, let's go now to the user interface side, right? So how does the user interface use this? Right, so it all starts with the entry point of our user interface is going to be this index.html, okay? What I've done here is that I've copied the directory that I gave you, as a starting point, and I copied it into this demo directory, and then I worked in there. So I didn't want to litter the starting code, so I put it here. All right, so let's see what we did for you in the last lecture. We had index, right? Index is the starting point. There's a lot of HTML stuff here that you don't really care about, but I'm just going to go over real quick. Here are some nice styling libraries that make our presentation a little bit more presentable, a little prettier. They're not required at all, but I put them in there if you want to clean up your user interface to make it a little more, spruce it up a little bit. We also loaded these libraries. This is what makes the React.js magic happen. Okay, so I included that here. You don't need to understand what that does. If you are interested, again, there's an entire course about doing all this, and you just have to accept that this is what makes some of this magic happen. Okay, don't touch it. Right? At least you break it. In the lecture that I'm referring to, right, we talked about creating a really simple front end just to display some very simple content. And everything in React.js is a component. Components can be implemented as classes or just plain old functions. And some components are small and represent a single button or something, a small portion of the screen. And some components can be as large as an entire screen. Or some components could be an entire application, right, that contain many screens, that contain many components, right? And so what basically a React application is a tree of components containing other components containing other components, right? And you have a root component that can bring in multiple screens and then decide to show this screen or that other screen, and each screen can then load other components and so on and so forth, right? So we implemented that last lecture. We implemented a couple of screens just to illustrate how is that we can navigate from one screen to another screen, right? So here we have a component representing like a home screen from where we can navigate to the rest of the application. And then we showed you some really simple navigations to screen 1 and screen 2. And so we then presented, learning how to navigate between two simple screens. We showed you, all right, well, let's now create 3 screens, right, that are useful to us. 2 screens. One is going to implement the list of all the users. It's going to go out and fetch the users from the database. Once it has the array of users, it's going to iterate over them and just display them in a list. Okay. Now, a separate screen component, we're going to call the user editor screen, is going to be able to edit a single user, right? So in the user list, we're going to have a kind of like a list of users. So if you click and select one of them, it's going to navigate to the user editor, and then the user editor is going to load that user from the database, and it's going to allow you to edit it, right? You can type in whatever you want to do and then save. It'll send it back to the server and then come back to the user list, right? All communication between between our user interface and the database, right? It's a good practice to pull all communication into a single file, right? And that's what user service does, right? Just like we have a DAO, a data access object, that is responsible to talking to the database, and we encapsulate in a single class. Same thing here, right? We are encapsulating all data communication with the server, with our DAO, right, into this user service. Notice that it's declared before these two, because these two use the user service, right? They use this over here. So it has to be declared in that order. So careful. Then we declare our top level component, right? And that's why we call it index.js, right? That's a very common name as an entry point for a JavaScript application. You know, just like in other languages, you might have main or init or other names like that. So index.js is a very common name as an entry point for a JavaScript application. We load the index. We load the index and then just ask our rendering engine to inject the content into an element whose ID is root, which happens to be this one over here. So all content is dynamically rendered here into this div, which is empty, right? There's nothing in there, but we dynamically put stuff in there. How do we put stuff in there? We start off with our index, right? That is it's exporting this app, right? And we import it, and then we render the content in what index comes back with. So if in index, we have the declaration of app, and then we export it at the bottom, right? So that our top level can import it and then render it. So anyway, so index or app is our root component, which is going to load everything else, okay? In particular, it's going to load a home component, a screen, our user editor, our user list, our screen 2. So it loads all the other ones, right? But not all of them at the same time, right? What we want to do is display one or the other depending, you know, how we're navigating, right? If we click here or click there, right, we want to navigate to different screens. So the way we do that is by using this hash router here. So a router in React.js is nothing more than a navigation mechanism, right? It's implementing a navigation and it's configuring what you see, what component, what screen do you see as the URL changes at the top, okay? So for instance, what we're saying here is that this slash, right, and the way you configure what you see as you navigate is through the declaration of multiple routes. Notice that all our screens are embedded inside of a route, right? So this is saying that if the URL, if you see slash, meaning the root, meaning you haven't typed anything, you just type localhost 8080 and that's it. You don't type anything else, right? Then you are at the root of the application, slash, right? And so what should we see? We should see the home screen, okay? In the home screen, we have several URLs. We have several links, 3 links, right? One of them allows us to navigate to screen 2. Another one allows you to navigate to screen 1. Another one allows us to navigate to user list. All of them update or update the URL so that if the URL changes, it triggers, right, what needs to be rendered next. Right? So for instance, we click on screen 1, the URL changes to /s1. But we configured here that if the path in the URL is s1, then we should see screen 1. If instead the path is ABC, then we should see screen 2. Okay, and that these are the links that change the URL and trigger the showing of one screen or showing the other screen, which was configured here. Okay. Right, so those are the easy ones, right? That again we covered in detail in the previous lecture. Definitely, again, I encourage you to go through that lecture on your own, and you're just going through it step by step. We go into nitty-gritty detail there. If we click on users, we click on users, right? We navigate to the user list. And the user list is going to render a list of users, right? And let me show you. I think I have it running. Yeah, right here. So this is the user list, right? And home, here's home. Home has 3 links. Again, screen 1, screen 2, or the user list, right? And this is where we're going to be focusing our time in this lecture. We're going to be building on this for the remainder of the hour or so, right? So what does user list do? So user list, on load, right? That's what user effects does, right? On load, it allows you to put in here what do you want to do when your component first loads. What does it do? It calls this FindAllUsers function, which is declared right here. See that? And what does this do? Well, it uses a function called the same name, but inside of user service, which does what? Well, if we go in there, notice that user service, we imported it here. So FindAllUsers is declared in there. So we can take a look at the declaration. It's this one. What does it do? Well, it sends a request to this URL over here. See that /API-users? Well, guess what? There is on the DAO somebody listening at /API/user. See that? So by sending a fetch sends an HTTP request to the server, right? And so somebody must be listening at API user, which happens to be this one. Well, somebody might say, well, wait a minute, I have 2, right? I have 2 /API-users. Which one is it? Is it this one or this one? Well, by default, if you don't say anything, right, fetch by default will send a get, right? The method will be get, right? So that's why it's really mapped to this over here, and this runs. This goes out to the database, does a select star from users, comes back with a all bunch of records, right? And then we convert it into an array of users, right? Which is then parsed by this user interface, right? It reconstructs that string of JSON into an array, okay? And then it makes it available to the user list. The user list, there's our data, comes back with the data, which hopefully is the array of users. And then we set it, we set a local variable called users using its mutator. We set the data, hopefully the array of users. We store it in a local variable, which we then use to iterate over. We can iterate over that array, parsing each user as we go, and rendering several line items. In each line item is a hyperlink that contains the user ID, first name, and last name, which is basically this rendering over here. Okay, for ID, first name, and last name. Okay. Now, each one is a hyperlink that link to a /users/user ID, right? So it creates links that include the ID as part of the URL, which we already had configured in our index. We had configured that if, right, we see something that looks like /users/something, okay, we navigate to the user editor, right? Notice that this here is /users/ is literally, right, needs to be /users/user, but over here we have a colon. See that colon? That means that this user ID is not hard-coded. This is just a placeholder. It's kind of like a variable, like a path variable that could be anything, right? It could be a number 22, 34, 67, whatever, right? And user editor is going to be able to parse this user ID because it knows the name of that variable, right? It's going to be able to parse it using useParam, right? Which we'll see in a minute. Okay, let's see. I think there's some question in the chat. How did you trigger the post response? Yeah, we haven't yet. We haven't done that yet, right? We'll do that today. When we create a new user. Yeah. Yeah. So now what we trigger so far is really only this one over here. This FindAllUsers. We haven't done this yet. We'll do that today. Okay. We'll have to send a post instead of a get. All right. So when we navigate to users, the URL will have the ID. See that? If I click, notice right now it's mapped to /users. All right, there's a question on the chat. Could you show the link part again? Sure. Here we have and all this code is, I'm going to push this so that you can take a look at it. it's in the assignment, right? The assignment walks you through all this. So all this code comes straight from the assignment. Okay, this is copy pasted from the assignment. All right, there's nothing here that I typed myself. I copied it straight from the assignment. And that's what we're going to keep doing for the remainder of the lecture. Yeah. So you have that in the assignment. Yeah, so navigate, so it encodes the ID as part of the URL. So notice here it says right now it's mapped to /users, which is /users is userless, and that's what we are, userless. But if I click on this, notice that it becomes /user/1. See that? If I go back, back and go to Charlie Brown, notice that it's /user/5, right? And so that 5 or 2 or 3 or whatever is accessible through a variable called user ID in the user editor. So what the user editor does, it says the users use params, right, to parse out whatever you want, whatever's encoded in there that has a specific name. In particular, we want the user ID. Why is it user ID? Because that's the name we gave it, user ID. Right? So we extract the user ID. What do we do? What do we do with it? We use it so that on load, we call FindUserId, passes the user ID that we just parsed from the path. Right? We call user ID, which is defined down here. And then FindUserId on load, okay, uses on the user service, the FindUserId passes the ID. Right? What does FindUserId does is that it takes the URL, and appends the ID at the end and sends a default get, right? So this URL is what? It's basically mapped to this right here, right? Right here, see that? Find /API users / and then the ID. Notice that I call FindUserId everywhere so that I can keep it straight in my head, right? Notice that I called it in the editor. I called it FindUserId here. Then I called it again in the user service. I called it FindUserId again here, right? And then I called it again the same way in the ORM, FindUserId. This is for me to just keep it straight in my head, right? That this is in the user interface, in the service, and then in the database, right? So that I know that all this is mapped all the way through. Okay, the names don't have to match, right? One could be called ABC, the other one XYZ, the other one RST. They don't have to match. I match them so that I can keep it straight in my head. All the flow of the data going from the user interface to the service to the database and then back, right? And then the whole flow. Make sense? Okay. So yeah. So once the database comes back with the object user, we parse it out from the body that came back from the server, and we make it available to the editor right here as data in the actual JSON object, which we use to store in a local user variable that we have the mutator here, right? And we update the local user variable, which we then use locally to populate several input fields, right? We populate this input field with the ID, this one with the first name, we populate it with the last name, username, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's where we left off last lecture, right? And so again, I welcome you to take a look at that lecture from yesterday, the day before. I uploaded it so that you can take a look at it and see this. We built all this last lecture. So yeah. All right, so let's keep going. Let's go a little further. Let's continue on the assignment. The assignment is right here. No, that's not the assignment. Let me close that. Close that. Close that. Okay, there we go. So yeah, so let's implement what's next. Let's see. There we go. So we did retrieving all the records. We did that already, right? Find all users. We also implemented find a user by ID. We did that already. Let's go on more. Let's see. We want to implement now. Now back, we did that also as well. We're going to delete. How about deleting a record from the database? Let's do that. Okay. So first of all, this asks you to asks you to review the delete function, right, in the repository, right? And we can certainly do that. There's our delete in the repository. You can just look at it, right, and say, okay, well, it's mapped to this. That's the URL that I need to generate, right? Also, I can't send a get or post or put. I need to send a delete, okay? Also, I need, and that's all. That's all I need to do from the user interface. I need to send that user URL and a delete. Okay, so let's do that. So the assignment asks you to, in the inside of the user service, right? Inside of the user service, you're going to copy this command right here, right? This is what's going to talk to the server, right? Hold on a second. All right, the dog wants to go upstairs. Okay, yeah, so we're going to copy that. Let's copy this right here, copy. And let's go into our user service, and we're going to paste it right here. Paste that, right? And we're going to, so let's look at what this does, right? So this is a function that takes as an argument the ID of the user that I want to remove. Is going to send a fetch, right, to the server, to this URL. Is going to put the ID at the end, right? So that now this URL matches what the server is waiting for, right? It's waiting for that URL. Notice that that URL here is indeed /API/user. See that? So it's definitely sending, and it's putting the ID at the end, right? So it matches this perfectly. Plus, the fetch by default uses a get, right? So all these two of these, right? This fetch and this fetch are sending by default gets. Here we're going to override it and say, no, we don't want get, right? Because the server is expecting a delete. Otherwise, I would not be calling this function. It needs to be a delete. Okay, so the way we do that is we use an optional additional configuration object, right? Which we can tell it the exact method we want to use, right? By default, this is get. So anyway, this is going to generate a delete to that URL with the ID, and we're going to just export it here so that we can use it outside of this file. And next, what we're going to do is that now we can use it. You can use it in our editor, right? We can create a function. We can create a function in the editor. We're going to put it right here, right before our return. We create a function that takes the ID locally here in our user interface, and it's going to use our service. And I guess I named it users. Okay, user. Okay, delete, find. Okay, there we go. So yeah, so it's going to use user service, the delete function we just wrote, right? That we just copied over, right? It's going to take that ID, which is going to remove it from the server. And once we're done there, it comes back telling us, yeah, you've successfully removed it. We're just going to use history to navigate back where we came from, which was the list of users, right? And hopefully that user won't be part of the list anymore, which will have been removed, right? Now, the way we're going to kick off this delete is by adding a new button, right? So at the end, at the bottom, right, we're going to add a brand new button way at the bottom here. We're going to add that button, which on click, when we click this button, is going to call our delete user that was right here. And we're going to pass it the user.id, right? Which is the object that we've been using, right? It's the same ID. This is the same ID that we're using it to render our input field, right? And we're going to pass it, we're going to call the button delete. Excellent. So I think we're ready. Let's refresh. There's our delete button. Let me cancel. Let's see. We have James Cameron. We have Alice. We have Charlie Brown. Let's remove Charlie Brown. So click on delete. Notice that Charlie Brown is gone. If I refresh, notice that they're gone, right? And I can also go check in the database. Notice that we go to users. Notice that we have all these users. Notice that Charlie Brown used to be there, but if I refresh, notice that Charlie Brown is no longer there, right? So definitely we went all the way from the user interface to the server, down to the database, and then back, right? So everything seems to be working. All right, let's keep going. So now let's talk about creating brand new records. Okay, so this one is going to be a little bit more involved. Okay, so stick with me. Let's see. We have in the database side, right? We have this post mapping, which we can see here in the ORM. We have this post right here, right? So we're expecting that the URL is /API-users, right? So nothing embedded at the end. Let's see, there's a question in the chat. How come after you click on delete, it puts you back at the previous page? Yeah, because that's what I told it here in the delete user, right? When it comes back from the server, right, I use history go back, right, to go back to wherever I had navigated from, right? So you could stay here, but you could stay in this page, but it would make no sense because the record doesn't exist anymore. So I just navigate to where I came from. Okay. Where was I? Right. So yeah. So I need to send a post, right, as opposed to a delete or a get. I need to send a post. We know how to do that already, right? It's just method, and then you say method post. So we know how to do that. That's easy. The URL, that is already the default URL anyway. Something new here, though, is that we need to embed, right, the new user and the body. So we don't know how to do that yet, right? So we need to somehow send a JSON object that contains all the information from the user, right? The first name, the last name, the username, password, blah, 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 all that. We need to send it over in the body. All right, so let's do that. And then this will parse out our JSON and then insert it into a database. Let's do that, right? So we go back to the editor. So in our editor, what we're going to do is we're first going to need to talk to the database, right? So we're going to copy this right here. And remember, any communication with the database, we are putting it in a single file, right? That is the only sole responsible for talking to the database, right? So there it is. So we have create user. It takes user as an argument. Presumably, this is an object that has username, password, first name, last name, all that good stuff, right? And we're going to send it over to the server. The only thing that's going to be missing is an ID, right? Because the ID is an auto increment when we insert, right? So we don't need to know the ID because it's a brand new record. We don't have the ID. Yeah, so there's our, we're going to be sending it to API users. That's exactly where we want to send it. So there it is, right? Notice that we are overriding, and it says we don't want get or delete, right? We're saying that we want the method to be post. And now we want to put this user, when I want to put this user that has the data, we want to put it in the body. That's easy. You just say body colon. Again, this is the optional configuration object, right? And we can put the body, and we're going to put in the body is the user, the JSON user, but we need to put it in a format that can be streamed over the HTTP protocol, right? And to do that, we're going to convert the user into a string representation, right, of just ASCII characters, right? You're making sure that we have the correct quotations, commas, curly brackets, square brackets, blah, 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 right? So JSON Stringify does that, right? It converts our binary representation of a user into a string representation so that it can be streamed across the HTTP protocol, right? And we're telling the server what, how to interpret this string. It's just going to be a string, right, of characters. We need to tell the server how to interpret it because it could be formatted in any million ways, right? It could be formatted as XML. It could be formatted as a comma-separated value. It could be a Word document or PDF or PowerPoint slides or whatever, right? It could be an image. So we need to tell the server how to interpret whatever we're sending over. And so we are configuring as using the standard MIME type, right? That is an international standard that says that defines all the possible data types of all possible documents that are transferred across the internet. Okay, so applications JSON is the international standard saying that this document is formatted. You should interpret it as JSON. Okay. Anyway, this goes over the fence of the server side. The server side reads, streams or recaptures all those bits and bytes that are coming from the user interface and reconstructs and instantiates a user object that it then uses to insert into the database. Okay, when it gets inserted in a database, now it has a primary key, right? And then it gets streamed back. The resulting record that was inserted into the database gets streamed back to the user interface with a primary key. Now it didn't have a primary key, right? And we parse that JSON object, we convert it back into JSON representation, and we are going to use it here in the editor. Right? Before we can use it in the editor, though, we need to export it here. Right? Let's export it. Now in the editor, we can actually use it now, right? Just like we used delete users and find user by ID in this user service, we're going to use it to create a brand new user. So let's do that. Yeah, so we exported it. So now we need to notice that this editor right now, the way we're using the editor is to right now the editor only knows how to edit existing records. Well, it doesn't even know how to do that. It only knows how to display existing records, right? So if I navigate to Alice, right, notice that it displays the record that already exists in the database, right? It fetches the record and displays it. But we can't even edit it, right? It doesn't even allow you to type it, right? And there's no button to update, right? So we're going to do update a little bit later. First, let's see if we can create a brand new document, a brand new record. So we'll need a create button here, and whatever we type here is what we want to create, right, into the database. But because this is a brand new record that we're going to create, it makes no sense to display anything here. Actually, it doesn't make sense for us to go fetch anything, right? Because this is a new record, right? There's no primary key or data or anything. We're going to create the new data, right? So this one here, see this one over here, or 5 or 6 or whatever, right? It makes no sense for us to even provide a primary key here, right? So what we're going to do, is that we're going to provide a dummy ID here, right? That it'll be easy to tell that this is not an actual record that exists. Instead, I want to tell this editor, don't go fetch anything. Instead, leave it blank so that we can actually type something, right? And then create that record, right? So let's do that. So the way we're going to do that, right, is that we already have a button, right? I believe we already have a button in the list, right? Remember, in the list, right, we have this add user. We want to navigate to here. We want to navigate here and leave it blank so that we can type something. So how do we do that? So what I'm going to do here in the user list, so the assignment shows you how to do it one way. I'm actually going to do it an easier way. You could totally do it the way the assignment does it, or do it this easier way that I just figured out. And I'm going to use a hyperlink instead, right? I'll need a hyperlink. Let's see. I'm going to link to. I'm going to create a link called add user. And I'm going to link to /user, just like this, /user, oops, to /users, and you're expecting an ID, right? Just like this, see that you're expecting an ID. Well, because this is a new user, there is no ID. So instead, I'm going to pass you some token, some value, right, that you can recognize and say, this is a new user. I shouldn't go fetch anything in the database, right? And I shouldn't update my fields, okay? And if I do that, in the editor, here, this user ID, usually this would be a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, the ID of the record that I want to show. This time around, though, it's not a number, right? So I should put here and say, well, only go fetch the user if, right, the user ID. So if the user ID is not new, then go fetch user ID by its ID. Make sense? All right, so that if I go back here, right, and I click on add user, if I click on it, notice that it goes to the user editor. Notice that the URL up there is /user/new. Notice that the user editor did not go fetch anything from the server and left this blank. Everybody good? All right, awesome. Okay, now we need to actually create the user, right? So how do we do that? Well, so first, let's follow the assignment. The assignment says that, right, there it is, right? Check to see if it's not new and then go fetch it. And here's our create. Here's our logic to create, right? Here's our logic to create. In the editor, we're going to have a function called create user, which we want to kick off with a button, with a create button. Right? We want to have a create button. And when we call that create button, we're going to pass it some user object, and we're going to use the service to send the user to the server using our create user server. See now this create user server, which we just wrote, right, takes a user and then it posts that user in the body to the server. All right, so we're going to kick it off, right? And then once we create the new user, we're going to come back to the user list, and that user hopefully is at the end of the list, right? Has been added to the list. Okay. All right. So how do we kick this off? We'll need a new create button, right? And there it is. There's a create button. I'm just going to copy that, and we'll put it at the bottom here. There's our create button. So it's going to kick off create user. And I'm going to pass this user object, right? This user object, which is, what user is this? Well, right now it's like a blank user, right? There's nothing in it, right? There's nothing in the user, right? Because we never went to fetch anything. You're supposed to actually type. You're supposed to actually type. Now the problem with typing, even though let's see, even though we can type, right, is all this information that we're typing in these input fields right now, the way it's implemented, it's being ignored, right? So we need to, as we type, we need to store this and build an object that we can then send to the server, right? Right now, all this information is being ignored, right? We used to use the user object, right, which is a local variable, right, which is empty, okay, to populate an input field. But now we don't have a user object because we never fetched it. Instead, we want to populate that user from our keyboard, not from the server. We want to populate it from our keyboard, okay? So how do we do that? So there's our input fields. These are all our input fields, which are trying to show the value of first name, of last name, and whatnot, but they don't have any values, right? Because we never fetched it. We want to populate it with our keyboard. How do we do that? Well, I'm just gonna show you how to do it. It's a little quirky. It's very peculiar to the way React.js works, right? It's a little awkward, but you know, it is what it is. That's the way React.js works. React.js, basically what it does is just, you know, as you type every single keystroke, right, it's going to update the user and put the data in the user object and keep track of that user for every keystroke, right? And so at any time, every keystroke you do, the user object has the very latest value. Okay, so let's do it. I'm giving you the code. It's a little quirky, but that's the way it works. So except for let's do it for the user, for the first name. I'm just going to copy this. I'm just going to paste it here for the first name. Let's just go over it real quick. Don't try to understand it. Only to the extent that you want to be able to reproduce this, right? Just by copying it and then making it work. So let me just explain how this works. So here we're adding an on-change event handler, meaning that as you type every keystroke, it generates an event, and that event, we're using that event to set the value of the user. We're going to update the value of the user, right, of the local variable, right? We're not sending anything to the server yet, right? We're updating the local copy of the user, right? Copy of the user. And so we're updating the old value of user. We're going to copy it over, Meaning, if this already had a first name or last name or first or username or whatever, we're going to copy everything over, but we're going to override the value of the first name. Okay, meaning this basically says leave what you had alone, but only update the first name to have the very latest value of the input field. That's basically what it says, right? So copy over the old value. That's what ... means. Copy everything over from the user, but override the current value of the first name to be whatever the input field. So e.target.value is the current value of the input field as you're typing. Make sense? All right, it's a little quirky, but you know that's how React works. I think they could improve on that a little bit, and perhaps in the next version they will improve that. So here's a last name, and we'll do the username. There we go. Okay, and I don't think I have that password. Okay, so I believe we have enough. Let's refresh. So let's see. We can create here maybe James. Oh, I think I have James Cameron. Linda Carter, L Carter, and we'll do a create, and there it is. Notice that Linda Carter is there. See that? There's Linda Carter. You can check the database, right, and refresh here, and notice that Linda Carter, indeed, we insert Linda Carter. Make sense? There, so we can delete, we can create. Let's do the last one, update. All right, let's take a look at update. Now that's pretty cool. Yeah, it is pretty cool. Let's keep going. Let's go on to now updating a record that already exists, right? And again, just follow the instructions. I think they're pretty good. I don't think there's any errors, but please let me know if you do find something. So for update, what we're going to do is, again, we're going to review what we have in the database, right? So what we have in the ORM, we already have an update in here, right? And the update is wants to have the ID encoded at the end of the URL, meaning this is the record that we want to update, right? We need to provide the primary key. And it's expecting a put, not a get, not a post, not a delete, but a put, right? Again, that's convention, right? That's industry standard convention. That if you're updating a record, you should use HTTP put, okay? We are going to parse this user ID from the path, but the new values for the user, because you changed a first name or a last name or username or password, you changed something, right? That's going to be embedded in the body, right? And we already know how to put something in the body, right? So we need to, instead of being a post, it needs to be a put. In the body, right, we're going to have to use the same thing. We're going to have to stringify and convert this thing to a string. And then over here, it's going to pull it out and reconstruct a user with the new values, the new updates, the user updates, right? And everything else is the same that we already know, right? We use the repository for updating a record that already exists. And the way that works is you first retrieve the record from the database, right? You read that with the select star, you know, from users where ID is blah, 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 right? You find that. And now that you have the record in memory, you can then now update each individual field or column, right? And just update it with whatever comes from the user interface, right? This is what comes from the user interface, right? And this is what is going to go into the database, right? So we update each field, each column, and then we can use save, right? That is going to generate an update into the database, right? It knows that this is not an insert, but it's an update because it knows it's an update because it knows that it fetched it from the database, right? So it's a record that already exists. So it issues an update as opposed to an insert, right? And then we just return the user object back to the user interface, okay? All right, so this is already implemented, so you don't have to do anything here. But on the user interface, we need to issue this put, right? With the correct URL, with the correct body, right, to this endpoint, right? So let's copy that. Let's copy that. And so in the service, we're going to paste this in there. There it is, right? So we're expecting the ID of the record that we want to update, the new values that we want to update. We're encoding the ID at the end of the URL. Notice that the method is a put, not a post, right? Not a get, it's a put. Same thing, we are converting our binary representation of a user into a string version, right? And then we're telling the server, right, the database to interpret this as JSON, right? And then we're going to come back with a new version, which we don't really care. We'll export this so that others can use our update user. Okay, so let's keep going. So now in the form, right? What we can do is now, create our update user event handler, right? And so in the user editor here, we can add this event handler here, which we want to kick off with a button, right? So we click the button and issue this update user with the ID and the new user, which is going to use the service, which is going to send this object, is going to put this object into the server. And then when it comes back, we just want to go back. Okay. All right. So we need that button. So let's copy that button. We'll put the button at the end. Here's our button, right? Which is going to kick off that event handler at the top. We'll pass the ID and the new user that we've been typing, editing, changing names and whatnot, right? And then we kick off the put to the server. All right, so let's refresh. Let's change Alice. So this is, maybe I'll call it Alicia. Right, so Alicia Wonderland. Right, we'll say save. And notice that indeed we changed the first name to Alicia instead of Alice. And so we click on that. Notice that the values indeed have changed. And we can check the database. We go to database. We'll see that this record should have changed. So let's refresh, and indeed it has changed. Right? There's the first name and the username have changed indeed. Okay. All right, and that's all, folks. Right? That's what we're asking you to practice on your own. Recreate what I've just illustrated here, and we encourage you to go even further. Right? We're asking you just to do this with the users, but certainly, right? Don't stop there. Just keep going. Practice it again. Try to maybe do the blogs, or do the post, or do something, or maybe create your own table, right? And start interacting and playing with it. And practice makes perfect, right? And if you have questions, certainly there's all these videos that you can come back to and take a look at. And certainly, the TAs and myself are here for you. All right, so we still have another 20 minutes. So let's practice this. Let's start going and maybe creating a brand new interface. Let's see. For the deliverable, what are examples of temporary directories we should remove? Oh yeah, so when this compiles, it creates this target directory here. This target directory that's an example of temporary directory. If you go in there, there's going to be classes, compiled classes, and jar files, and a whole bunch of stuff that we don't want you to include, right? And so yeah, so don't try. Just remove this class directory. You can say right click here and just blow it away, and then you can zip this up and then send it over. Okay. All right, so let's practice this and maybe interact with blogs, right? So let's see, we have blogs here, and we have let's see how many blogs we've got. Let's run this. Okay, we got 4 blogs, right? So let's see if we can build something that displays these blogs in the next 15 minutes. All right, so let's come here and in the source, in the web app here, in the demo, let's create a brand new component, a screen component that can list the blogs, right? So we'll call it JavaScript. This will be blog list. Okay, and this blog list, we'll call it const blog list, and it's going to return for now, return div, and this will be h2 blog list. Okay, and we need to export this. export default blog list. Okay. Now, every new file that you declare, right, or you implement, you need to declare it in the HTML document, right? And notice I'm going to declare it before the index because the index references everything else, right? So it needs to be declared before the index. Right? So the order here matters, right? So I'm just going to copy this here. I'm going to paste it, and this is going to be the new blog list. There we go. Okay. So now we're inside of the index, right? We want to create a navigation so that we can display this blog list, right? So we're going to create maybe, I don't know, anywhere really. Here we're going to say, maybe call it blogs, and we're going to display the blog list, right? So if you see /blogs in the URL, you will see the blog list. And we need a link to navigate to it. So we'll create here a brand new list, a link that says blogs, and this is blog list, so that we can go back and refresh our home, and we have the blog list here. See, yeah, we click on blog list, we navigate to our brand new blog list screen here. Okay. So how do we display the blogs? Well, we have to first make sure that the server and the database are exposing the data model, right? So let's go back to the server and see what we have there. Let's see, do we have a data model for blogs? Looks like we don't, right? So let's create a data model for blogs. So let's say new Java, and we'll call it blog, right? And this blog, we have, what do we have in a blog? So it has to match the database, right? So we have, put it side by side. So let's see, we have an ID, name, topic, create, update, and user, right? So let's put here private integer ID, oops, integer ID. We have name, so that's going to be a string. We have topic, I think that's also a string. And I'm going to do it simple, so I'm just going to skip over to user here. So user, that's an integer. So say private integer user. Okay, and we're going to generate the setters and getters. There we go. Okay. We also need to annotate this to map to that table, right? The blogs table. Right. So we're going to declare this as an entity. We're going to map it to a table, and the name of the table is blogs, right? We also need to declare this as a primary key, and we need to declare this to be generated as a auto increment with the strategy of the identity. There we go. All right, so we're done with the data model. Okay, now we need to create the CRUD interface that allows us to actually start interacting with it, right? So let's do that. And so let's see, I imagine we don't have a repository, so let's create a repository for the blog. Right? So we can say new Java class, actually it's an interface, right? And this is a blog repository, right? So in that repository, this is going to extend, right, our CRUD repository that we're going to configure so that we can CRUD blogs, right, blog records. And we need to tell it what the primary key data type is, which is an integer. There we go. All right, that's it. That's all we need to do, right? Obviously, we can override some of the queries, but I'm just going to use the default implementation just to keep it simple. Now we need to expose data, right, to the rest of the world through a DAO. Right, so let's create a DAO, right, and this will be a blog DAO or RAM DAO, and so this is going to use our brand new repository. So the blog repository, okay, it's going to use it to implement all the CRUD operations. For instance, one of the things that we'd like to be able to do, right, since we're trying to implement our blog list wants to list all the blogs, right? So let's implement that. Let's say public list blog, find all blogs, right? And we'll need to include that as well. And this is just going to return whatever the repository. Now remember, the repository has a generic version of this, right? That can retrieve all the records. The only thing that it returns as an iterator, that's easy. We can just cast, right? We can just cast this, cast. Ideally, what we could do is just override and implement our own select star, right, from blogs. But let's just use the default implementation. And casting is just as easy. All right, so there we go. So we have this, right? The only thing left to do is to expose this as an HTTP API so that we can hit it with our user interface, right? So let's do that, right? So we're going to convert this into a REST controller, and we're going to auto-wire this, and we are going to expose this as a GET because it's a read operation, right? According to the convention, is that we're going to hit this with an HTTP GET, and is going to be mapped to API. Again, this is a data source. That's why we prepend it with API. And the table that we're hitting, right, is the blogging table, right? So that's what we're retrieving. All right, excellent. That's all we need, right? So now we're ready to start hitting this with our user interface. So let's head over to the user interface and try to interact with this. We'll need to restart the server so that it'll compile and build and restart our server with our brand new powers over here. And so let's see, let's go to a blog list. So in the blog list is where we want to fetch all these blogs. So what we want to do, well, first, let's see with our new server up and running, if we can access those blogs with those brand new user interfaces that we created, right? So we have localhost 8080/API/blogs. There we have. So we have we definitely have access to the blogs, right? There's our 4 blogs, right? So we want to do this instead of manually. We want to do this programmatically by hitting it with our user interface. Let's see, there's a question in the chat. What happens if you don't have the auto-wire annotation? Can you do it manually? No, not really. Those are resources that are managed by the server. The server is the one who has connections to the databases, and also is the ones who have instantiates a single instance of that CRUD operator, CRUD repository, so that it can be shared amongst all the other classes. So you don't want to instantiate it yourself, like new and then blog repository. You don't want to have multiple instances of this running around. Instead, you want to have a single instance that is shared amongst the entire infrastructure. It's called the singleton pattern, design pattern, where certain objects you do want to have a single point that is shared amongst everybody. So yeah, so it needs to be auto-wired. There's other ways that you can auto-wire not using auto-wired, but it is by far the easiest. All right, so we have access to the data. We don't want to do this manually. We want to do this programmatically from our user interface. So let's do that. The best practice is that we create a service, right? So we'll create a blog service, right? That is going to encapsulate all data communication with the server, right? So let's do that. So we'll declare a blog URL, right? That is going to be equal to the URL that we want to hit. This is the URL, right? That's the URL, right? So we're trying to, we're trying to hit which one? We're going to try to hit this one right here, okay? Which is expecting a get and that URL, okay? And we're going to call it the same name, right? Just to keep it straight in my head, right? So it's const the same name. And what are we doing in there? We are doing a fetch, right, to that URL. All right, we're going to leave the default, which is a get, right? It's a get, and the response that comes back from the server is going to we're going to have to parse out the content and convert it back into JSON, right? And then we can use it from outside of this file, right? So that we can use it maybe to render in the user interface, right? So let's export this. Default the find all blogs, right? So now that we have this, remember any new file that you create, you need to declare it in the index, right? So you need to remember that. I'm just going to copy it. Notice that I'm going to put it, I'm going to declare it right before our blog list, the blog service, because blog list is going to use blog service. So it needs to be declared before the blog list, okay? All right, now that it's been declared, I can go back to my list and import it. I can import the blog service from the blog service. There it is, right? And I can now I can now call the blog service on load, right? So basically, what we want to do is have a function here that on load is going to find all blogs, okay? And is going to kick off what is the blog service find all blogs. And when it comes back with the data from the server, right, we want to do something. What do we want to do? We want to copy it into a local state variable, right? So we'll probably need that state variable over here. Let's declare, we'll need use state to declare the state variable, and we'll need use effect to kick off the when we load, right? We want to kick off and call that find all blogs. We want to be notified that this is we're being loaded. It's almost like a constructor, right? Where you can initialize yourself, right? And we grab that from React. Okay, so let's declare the state variable. We'll call it blogs, and we'll need a mutator that will allow us to set the values. And we'll use state, and we'll initialize it to an empty array of blogs, right? An empty array. Now we can kick off and say that on load, we can do whatever we want here. On load, what do we want to do? We want to call the find all blogs function that we just declared down below, which is going to do what? It's going to go and fetch from the server, from the database, right? And it's going to do what? The data that comes back from the server. Hopefully this is the array of blogs, right? Hopefully it's this, right? It should be this array. What do we do with that? We want to set the blogs, right? We say set the blogs to this data that's coming from the database. Again, hopefully it's that array, right? And let's display here. We can display the blogs, how many there are. Right, we can display their length, right? So length, again, it's an array. Hopefully it'll be 4, right? So let's see. If we refresh, what do we get? 0. So that was not good, right? Let's see if we can debug what's going on. Looks like something happened in the console. Oh yeah, so it's complaining that we're violating a security policy that my API blogs is running on port 8080, but this application is running on 63.342, and that's considered to be a violation of security policy. We can override that easily, and it's not as a big deal as you might think. We can say here that we are okay with cross-domain communication, right? That if the server is running on one side, if the database is running on one side, but the user interface is running on a different, right? We are totally okay with that, right? So we're going to say that we are accepting any origin. From where's your request coming from? I don't care, right? We're saying asterisk or origins. Okay, we're saying that I'm accepting communication from anybody. All right, let's restart that. And as that is coming up, we can go back to the user interface and render again. Okay, let's refresh. And this time around, we got 4. Excellent, we got 4. You can see the network. You can totally see the network. Oops, we're like in an endless loop here. Endless loop, so careful. We forgot to tell this here. There we go. And let's refresh. Okay, now we stopped in an endless loop. Okay, it's no longer an endless loop. Notice that it was hitting the server over and over and over, right? It was hitting the database over and over and over, asking for the blogs, right? So yeah, so there's our blogs. There's our request that went out. Notice that we are indeed receiving the response with the 4 blogs that we have in the database. We need to render it. Let's render it real quick. And the way to render it, it's simple. We can have a list here, and that we can dynamically fill in that list, an unordered list, UL unordered list, with any number of line items. We can populate. So normally you can just say some static blogs, right? So the blog, 1, 2, 3, right? And so you can have any number of blogs here, right? 2, 3, 4. So these are all static, right? And you can, if you render them, there they are static, right? We don't want static, we want dynamic. It's whatever it's coming from the database, right? Where we have names right there, SpaceX and Tesla and blah, 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 right? So instead of static, right, we can do some dynamic content by embedding some code here that is going to iterate over those blogs. So here's blogs, we're going to iterate over them. So map iterates over an array, right, and then passes, you can define a function here that can process each one of those elements, right? So as it iterates, it's going to pass us an instance of each element in the array, right? So each element is a blog object. What do we want to do? Well, what this evaluates to, this map function evaluates to the concatenation of whatever the function returns, right? So if the function returns, just the names of the blog, it'll come. The result will be the concatenations of all the names of the blogs, right? What we want to do is return a whole bunch of these, right? So we're going to return a whole bunch of these here, okay? But not always the same value. Instead, we want the names of the blogs, right? So instead of this being hard-coded, this could be an expression, blog.name. See that? And if we refresh here, notice that now, there we go. See that? We have the 4 names of the blogs that are in the database, right? So we no longer really need this hard-coded stuff here, right? We can totally live with the dynamic portion and display that. All right. Obviously, right, if you want to keep practicing this, ideally you would now, navigate from the blog to an editor where you can change the name of the blog, change the title, change, whatever you want, or the topic. So that would be definitely great, something for you to explore on how to manipulate this, how to interact with this. One thing that we haven't discussed is, now how do you tie these two things that, that perhaps you don't want to show all the blogs. Maybe you want to show the blogs only that pertain to Tesla or the ones that pertain to SpaceX. How do you filter that, right? So now when you're talking about like one-to-many relationship, right? Of saying one user has many blogs. So if you have a user and I want to navigate to that user's blogs, well, how do I do that, right? Well, then you need to implement those queries in the repository, so that, and then expose it to the URL, and then you can access it from the user interface, right? And display whatever it is that you want to display, right? And we'll keep talking about this as we progress, and I'll show you more and more things, especially when we get to the last couple of weeks when we are going to be discussing more and more about the project, okay? All right, that's all I have for you folks. Any question? Again, for the project, don't feel overwhelmed that you need to do anything fancier than what we're doing here for the user interface. Right? This is not a web development course, so a lot of things here I'm just waving my hands, and we're not going into much detail because it's not the focus of this course. The intention is to give you enough tools, right, for you to write something meaningful. That you can interact and have some just basic CRUD operations on tables that are related to one another and so on and so forth. Okay, and so you're not expected to create anything fancier than this. I mean, you're welcome to, obviously, if you feel to explore, and definitely will support you. but definitely it's not at all the intent for you to do anything fancier than this. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.